Welcome to the Writer Reads Short Stories. Today's story is The Buried Blade, and this is part one. The sword sang in the darkness. It sang through the rubble and the bones of skeletal fingers that had wrapped themselves around it. The song could not be heard through the muffling shroud of earth covering the sword, although it echoed throughout the ancient citadel that was imprisoned with it. The song seeped through the earth for an age, pushing upward and infecting the soil as it went. It was inevitable that, where the song forged the way, the ghosts would follow. Nature tried to sound a warning, but its guardians were gone, driven out or sleeping, or unaware of their powers and the responsibility that went with them. Animals fled the mounded earth beneath the grassy field. At least, they fled it where they could. The wild ones forsook it with the freedom that only they possessed, while those of domesticity's prison could only show their reluctance for the field before their masters forced them into it. "Dern beast!" Willis Harron cried, bringing the willow switch down upon the milk cow's rump. She was the last of the herd to be forced through the gate, and though she had been the easiest of them all, Willis was ready to send her to the knackery. He waved his switch at her once more as his niece closed the gate behind her. "Don't know what's got into them," he muttered as he climbed the fence beside the field. "They've been right skittish of late." Amanda looked at her uncle. The cattle weren't the only ones who'd been skittish about the field. She'd watched the rabbits forsake their warren and the morning fox skirt cautiously around the fence instead of cutting straight across the field as he usually did. Even the birds had stopped hunting for worms within its bounds. Amanda said nothing of this to Willis. He wouldn't have believed her. He might even have laughed. She followed his broad, no-nonsense back toward the small house that served him and her aunt as home, the smell of breakfast driving the field strangeness from her mind. The sword's song kept upward until the cattle began to lose their milk, and Willis's threat of both knackery and willow switch were no longer incentive enough to goad them through the gate. The field's grass began to fade. Willis moved the cattle to another field and watched their milk improve. Amanda, interested by this unseasonal change, began collecting soil samples to take back to school. She was studying science, and the soil in the field might provide her with a project for her final year. It was what she found while collecting the samples that changed her interest from soil to archaeology. A pottery fragment had ridden the waves of song to a few centimeters from the surface. Amanda found it when she was lifting another sample of dirt into a test tube. The metal spoon she was using chipped the dirt away from the fragment's surface, and blue paint gleamed brightly on the hillside. She rubbed at it until the pattern became clear, and her soul leapt with excitement. "Willis!" she cried, running down the hill, the fragment in her hand. "What?" Willis cried in return, worried that perhaps his niece had hurt herself in her strange excursion. Amanda was breathless when she reached him. "Look what I found," she said, holding the fragment toward him on her palm. Amanda was breathless when she reached him. "Look what I found," she said, holding the fragment toward him on her palm. Curious, he took it. The pattern of blue was clear now. Willis frowned as he studied it. The pattern seemed to weave before his eyes. A snatch of song whispered in his hand. He blinked uncertainly and handed it back to her. "That's a pretty stone, love," he said. Amanda looked at him strangely. "Pretty stone?" She glanced at the piece of pottery on her palm. It was still pottery, and the design was as blue as it had been before. "Pretty stone? I found it on the hill, Uncle Willis," she said. "That's nice, love," he answered, patting her on the head and walking away from the machinery he'd been fixing. "You put it somewhere safe now." "I will, Willis," Amanda told him. He waved at her without turning around and walked through the back door of the house. Amanda watched the door close behind him and tucked the fragment in her jacket pocket with the rest of her equipment. The cool feel of the test tube's glass and the clink of it against the piece of pottery reminded Amanda of her project, and she followed her uncle through the back door of the house. Other fragments rode the waves of song to the surface, and the song protected them from Willis's recognition. Willis, it sensed, was a guardian. It could see the aura of his power lying dormant beneath the surface of his mind. A guardian. It hummed softly, reaching the tips of the grasses and climbing its way up the trunks of trees. It would have to find a champion for itself if a guardian dwelt in its chosen domain. Everything it touched began to blacken and die. The birds now flew around the field, no longer perching in its trees. Shadows gained substance as they lurked within its evening bounds. Willis scratched his head as he watched the field die. He saw how the cattle in neighbouring fields grazed further and further from its fence. It was strange behaviour for creatures always seeking greener pastures. He moved his cattle so there was an empty field between them and the infected land, and he watched Amanda as she made her daily excursions into the dead ground. In the field, the song rose higher. In the soil, its influence spread wider. Now the neighbouring fields were beginning to die, starting at the fence. The wild creatures were seen less and less amongst their grasses. Unnoticed by the humans dwelling nearest, the song's taint hung in the air. Amanda, constantly visiting the hill above the buried city and digging in the soil that lay over the sword itself, did not notice when the sword reached hungry strands of music in her direction. She was still finding the pottery. Now red was mingled with the blue. She couldn't wait for the holidays to end. Between the soil and the fragments, she knew she had more than enough project material to pass her final year. She might even pass with honours. The sword lifted a bronze cup from the ruins of a nearby table and pushed it upward on the waves of its song. The cup arrived the day before Amanda left for school. Amanda shouted with delight when she found it, but Willis saw only another larger piece of rock and wondered at her fascination. "Surely you've enough bits of stone," he protested as she packed it into her suitcase. "This will be the last one, Uncle," Amanda reassured him. He noted the puzzled look she gave him and shrugged. Amanda carried her case to the car and loaded it carefully into the trunk. In the morning, Willis took her to catch the train, and the sword's music sought her in vain. The seed it had planted while she had worked in its field grew into a vine of worries that made her restless and irritable. She completed her homework and worked on the soil samples. To her surprise and her teacher's consternation, the soil appeared to be perfectly normal. Amanda planted seeds in the samples she'd brought from her uncle's farm, and, when they failed to flourish as the seeds planted in potting mix did, planted seedlings. Within a week, the seedlings in the test soil had begun to fail, while the seedlings in the potting mix were growing strongly. Amanda sought the answer in every agricultural text she could find, and eventually went to one of the universities in the city. The lecturer studied her notes with interest. "And you're sure you did everything as you've written it?" he asked. Amanda sighed. "Yes, sir, exactly as I've written it." He leaned back in his seat and stared at her, frowning. "It's a remarkable piece of research," he said at last, "but I cannot help you. I haven't heard of anything like this happening before. Leave me a copy of your work, and I'll look into it further." Amanda gave him the copy she had prepared. It was exactly the same as the original she'd brought for him to read. He took it and sat it on the desk in front of him. "I'll call you," he promised, already lifting the text once more. "Thank you," Amanda said, and left. Her teacher said that since the results of her experiments were inconclusive, she would be marked down on her project. Amanda brought the pottery fragments to him the next day. "I'd like to change my project," she said, handing him one of the fragments. She watched as he took it and held it up to the light. After a moment of silent study, he looked away from the fragment. "To this?" he asked. Amanda nodded. "Yes, I would like to investigate the pottery's origins," she told him. "Where did you find it?" "In the same field that I took the samples from," she replied. Her teacher frowned. "Only in that field?"